As a director, I see my job as sort of being the audience on set. I'm there to experience the story, shot by shot.
What exactly happened to Christopher Nolan? Now, he's still one of the most famous and acclaimed directors of the 21st century and one of my personal favorites. Despite what you may feel about him, it's impossible to deny that he's one of the only directors working today whose name alone is able to generate hundreds of millions of dollars. With that said, there's also been a lot of newfound pushback and criticism against the director, and it's not just a small group of people who find him overrated, or people who just never clicked with his work. I think there's been a definitive shift in the director's reputation over the past few years, and while it's not some complete reevaluation that's tarnished his legacy, there does seem to be a lot more hesitancy and criticism against his films and his directing. While this is the most apparent with the backlash against the Odyssey, it's not something regulated to that one film. If anything, the backlash from the film may have started a chain reaction that caused people to look back on his work in a new light. And this is especially in regards to his more recent films. So what exactly happened?
Well, I've seen too much. Well, we'll try and keep up.
Coming off of Oppenheimer, Nolan is on top of the world. Even with the phenomenon of Barbenheimer, there's really no other director in the world right now whose name alone could make a 3-hour historical biopic a billion-dollar blockbuster. Not only was the film a massive commercial success, it also won Nolan his first and only director win at the Oscars.
Christopher Nolan Oppenheimer.
And I think this part is really important. Nolan is a filmmaker that, while obviously successful and adored by general audiences, has always been someone who never really got the acclaim from critics and awards that people think he should have got. Aside from most technical categories, his films have infamously been snubbed from the Oscars. The Dark Knight wasn't even nominated for Best Picture in 2009, which sparked huge debate and led to the expansion of the Best Picture category. Nolan himself was never even nominated until Dunkirk and never won until Oppenheimer. Being a historical biopic, Oppenheimer also provided Nolan with a more serious film that resonated with award shows and gave him the dramatic historical movie that finally gave the director the critical praise many thought he deserved. Because of this, there really is no area in which Nolan could any longer be considered underrated, and inevitably what this means is that any opinion that deviates from how he's generally rated can only be from people who think he's overrated. Losing the sense of the underrated snub director that never properly got his flowers to becoming the Academy Award-winning director whose films are also billion-dollar hits, Nolan became the biggest director in the world, inherently inviting people to call him overrated. But I think that's the most superficial and basic reason behind this change, and what I believe is more important is what actually changed in the films themselves. While the online discourse surrounding the director may seem abrupt and as a direct reaction of just the Odyssey, there has been a very clear change in Nolan's films that has led to some of this criticism, and it's one marked by the release of one of his most celebrated works, Interstellar. A lot of things in Nolan's career changed after this, and what I want to look at is the influence of a key collaborator that defined the director's early work and career. And that's Jonathan Nolan, Christopher Nolan's brother, and the co-writer for a lot of the films before Dunkirk, like The Dark Knight, Interstellar, Memento, and The Prestige. With the absence of Inception, which was an idea and story Christopher Nolan had been developing for over 10 years, Jonathan had been involved in the scripting process for every one of his major films up to Interstellar. And to me, this film marks a huge turning point in the director's filmography. There's a noticeable shift in the films from before and after this time, marked also by the change in cinematographers, going from Wally Pfister to Roy van Hoytema. But the change I want to look at is one that I think is directly influenced by the absence of Jonathan Nolan. One of the biggest critiques leveled against Nolan is that his work can often be cold and technical, lacking the warmth and humanity that makes character journeys compelling. That they're often over-reliant on plot and big concepts rather than interesting characters with emotional cores. And this is something mostly said about him in recent years and with his past few films, which makes a lot of sense looking at the timeline of how things went. Nolan's films before Dunkirk didn't really have these problems. The Dark Knight trilogy is focused on Bruce and his story, and he's widely regarded to be the best live-action version of the character. Interstellar is a film with a lot of heart, where the relationship between Cooper and his daughter is the core of the film, similar to Inception with Cobb and his wife. Memento is really the only film where this critique could be used, but it's not a complaint that was really present until his later films. And I think Jonathan Nolan is a big reason why. After Interstellar, Jonathan Nolan went on to work on his own projects, and Christopher Nolan would then go on to write the rest of his films by himself. In fact, he even had to be convinced into writing a script for Dunkirk. Dunkirk, Tenet, and even Oppenheimer are the films really critiqued for this lack of warmth and humanity. Even Oppenheimer, while following the actual person, feels very cold and almost puts him at an arm's length away. The supporting characters are basically characterized by just being A-list celebrities, and Nolan's inability to write women has already been made fun of before. Dunkirk and Tenet don't even bother with character arcs or journeys, and while that does seem very intentional, it's an aspect of his writing that felt very anchored with his previous films. And I think a large part of that was his collaboration with his brother, as after, he essentially became a one-man army and we start to see some of the cracks in his writing and directing. Steven Spielberg is one of the best directors of all time. His work is also mainstream and one of the immediate answers a normal person would have to the question, who's your favorite director? And what I think really separates Spielberg's and Nolan's perception within the cinephile community is the intellectualism, or lack thereof, in both their films. This isn't to say their films are dumb or just Fast and Furious movies, but their work is clearly much more mainstream and fits within the popcorn movie category more than the works of directors like PTA or Scorsese. I think the key difference between them, however, is the heart and humanity at the center of Spielberg's films, and also how there's never a perception of some greater intellectualism. Now, with where this is going, I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to call Nolan pretentious in any way. I think that's a very reductive criticism, and it doesn't get at the root of why he's not as well regarded within the cinephile community. With that said, I think there's a general notion that these films portray themselves as incredibly smart, intellectual, and serious. Or at least that's what general audiences take away from them. There's obvious factors like the nonlinear storytelling and massive concepts that give this kind of perception to general audiences. And for as good as I personally consider these films to be, I think to a lot of cinephiles, when you strip away the facade of intellectualism and cleverness, for the most part the films don't have the same substance as films from other directors like PTA. For every massive, complex concept, there's also a clunky exposition scene that explains in full detail what's happening.
I brought myself here. We're here to communicate with a three-dimensional world.
For all the non-linear storytelling, the characters' journeys and arcs often take a backseat to the actual plot. With Spielberg films, they're presented as the entertaining popcorn movies they are, and they're absolutely fantastic because what's great about them is the story, characters, and direction. The point isn't to say that he's just a popcorn movie filmmaker, the point is that those films have so much heart and substance without any display of trying to be overly intellectual. The cleverness and intelligence of the films comes down to just how good they are, how interesting the themes are, how good the character arcs are, and how well shot and staged they are. Whereas with Nolan's films, there's more a sense of, and like I said, I really hate to use this word, but pretentiousness. While for the most part he's still very well respected in these communities, I don't think he has the same level of acclaim as other filmmakers, and he's kind of an easy director to make fun of. Now a lot of this makes it sound like I dislike Nolan as a filmmaker, which really couldn't be further from the truth. He's one of my favorites, and personally a director I love even more than Spielberg. This really is just to get a sense of perspective as to how deeper pockets of moviegoers view him, and how that view is becoming more prevalent amid the backlash to the Odyssey and his clout after Oppenheimer. I think in the pursuit of a larger audience, his work has kind of drifted to become plot-based action that's driven forward by concepts and set pieces. And I think that's slowly moving away from the clever, well-crafted character pieces that defined his early work. Every one of his movies now is filled to the brim with A-list celebrities, and it almost feels like the authenticity of the work is starting to crack, and nothing shows that better than the discourse surrounding the Odyssey. To this day, I would probably consider The Prestige the best written Nolan film, one that's truly brilliant and uses the non-linear format not just as a tool to frame the story, but as an actual mechanism to reveal things that constantly change our view of the characters. Unfortunately, it's also the one general audiences are probably the most unfamiliar with. But let me know what you guys think. Do you think Nolan's reputation has changed over the years, and how do you feel about his filmography as a whole? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Over Essay Films.